In the winter of 1897, 17 children vanished from the Elderglen Children's Home in Burlington, Vermont, leaving behind only charred bones and a silence that would endure for decades. The official report stated that a faulty heating system caused the tragic fire that consumed the eastern wing of the prestigious Elderglen Children's Home on February 14, 1897. What the report failed to mention were the 17 small bodies found in the basement, their bones showing signs of deliberate mutilation, or the fact that the fire had been set from the inside. The Elderglen family, pillars of Burlington society and benefactors to countless orphan children, had built their reputation on Christian charity and moral education. But beneath the polished marble floors and stained glass windows of their institution lay a network of chambers that would make even the most hardened investigators sick to their stomachs. This is the story of how one of New England's most respected families used their position of trust to commit unspeakable acts against the most vulnerable members of society, and how the truth was buried so deep that it took nearly 8 decades to surface. The institution's reputation. The Elderglen Children's Home stood like a beacon of hope on the hill, overlooking Lake Champlain in Burlington, Vermont. Built in 1867 by the wealthy Elderglen family, the imposing Gothic Revival structure housed up to 60 orphan children at any given time. The 3-story brick building with its distinctive tower and ornate stonework was considered one of the finest charitable institutions in New England. Cornelius Elderglen, the family patriarch, had made his fortune in the lumber industry during the Civil War. A devout Methodist and pillar of the community, he believed that caring for orphan children was his Christian duty. His wife, Margaret, shared his philanthropic vision, and together they established the home with the stated mission of providing education, moral guidance, and preparation for productive adult life to children who had lost their parents. The Elderglen family's reputation was impeccable. Cornelius served on the Burlington City Council for 12 years and was a founding member of the Vermont Children's Welfare Society. Margaret was president of the Ladies' Christian Aid Society and organized annual charity galas that raised substantial funds for the home. Their son, Dr. Theodore Elderglen, was a respected physician who served as the home's medical director, providing free health care to the children and earning praise from the medical community for his innovative treatments. The home operated under strict Christian principles, with daily chapel services, rigorous academic instruction, and vocational training programs. Children learned reading, writing, arithmetic, and practical skills like carpentry, sewing, and farming. The Elderglen family took pride in their placement record. Over 90% of their graduates found employment or were adopted by respectable families throughout Vermont and neighboring states. Local newspapers regularly featured positive articles about the home's work. The Burlington Free Press called it a shining example of Christian charity in action, while the Vermont Telegraph praised the Elderglen family's unwavering dedication to the moral and intellectual development of society's most vulnerable children. Prominent visitors, including the governor of Vermont and several U.S. congressmen, toured the facilities and left impressed by the clean dormitories, well-equipped classrooms, and apparent happiness of the children. The home staff consisted of 12 carefully selected individuals, most of whom had worked for the family for years. Sarah Coleman, the head matron, had been with the institution since its founding, and was known for her stern but fair approach to child discipline. James Franklin, the groundskeeper and maintenance supervisor, lived on the property with his wife, and maintained the extensive gardens and farm that helped feed the residents. Dr. Theodore Elderglen's medical practice was based in the home's infirmary, where he treated not only the residents, but also provided services to the broader Burlington community. The Elderglen family's charitable work extended beyond their own institution. They donated generously to churches, schools, and other orphanages throughout Vermont. Cornelius established a scholarship fund for promising students from poor families, while Margaret organized clothing drives and food distributions for struggling families in Burlington. Their philanthropy was so extensive that when Cornelius died in 1889, the entire city mourned, and his funeral was attended by over 2,000 people. After Cornelius's death, control of the home passed to his son Theodore. who maintained the institution's sterling reputation while expanding its programs. He established a workshop where older boys learned carpentry and metalworking, and he added a domestic science program for girls. The home's garden and farm operations grew to include a dairy, poultry operation, and greenhouse that supplied fresh produce year-round. Theodore's wife, Helen, took over Margaret's role as the home's social coordinator, organizing fundraising events and maintaining relationships with potential donors. She was particularly skilled at identifying wealthy families who might be interested in adoption, and her efforts resulted in dozens of successful placements for the home's children. The financial operations of the home were managed by Charles Baker, a trusted family friend and accountant who had handled the Elderglen family's business affairs for decades. Baker maintained meticulous records of donations, expenditures, and the home's various revenue-generating activities. The institution's books were audited annually by the state, and inspectors consistently praised the home's financial management and transparent accounting practices. By 1895, the Elderglen Children's Home was widely regarded as the finest institution of its kind in Vermont. It housed 57 children, ranging in age from 4 to 16, employed a staff of 15, and operated on an annual budget of over $8,000. The home's reputation was so strong that families from neighboring states specifically requested that their orphaned children be placed there. The children who lived at the home seemed well cared for and content. They attended regular classes taught by certified teachers, participated in recreational activities, and were encouraged to develop their individual talents and interests. Many formed close friendships with their fellow residents, and alumni often returned to visit and share news of their adult lives. However, beneath this veneer of Christian charity and moral education, darker currents were beginning to flow. The home's isolation on the outskirts of Burlington, combined with the absolute authority wielded by the Elderglen family, created an environment where abuse could flourish unchecked. The very qualities that made the institution appear so admirable, its strict discipline, its emphasis on obedience, and its closed community structure, also made it the perfect cover for unspeakable crimes. The basement levels of the home, which visitors were told contained storage areas and mechanical equipment, actually housed a network of specialized rooms that served far more sinister purposes. These chambers, accessed through hidden passages and locked doors, were where the Elderglen family's true nature would eventually be revealed. But for now, in the mid-1890s, the home continued to operate with the full respect and support of Vermont society, its dark secrets buried beneath layers of Christian piety and charitable good works. Ignored signs. The first signs that something was wrong at the Elderglen Children's Home began to surface in the spring of 1894, though they were subtle enough to be easily dismissed by those who preferred not to look too closely. Dr. William Harris, a physician who occasionally substituted for Dr. Theodore Elderglen, noticed some disturbing patterns during his visits to the home's infirmary. Harris had been called to the home in March 1894, when Dr. Elderglen was attending a medical conference in Boston. He found several children suffering from what appeared to be severe malnutrition, despite the home's reputation for providing excellent care. More troubling were the injuries he observed, burns, cuts, and bruises that seemed inconsistent with normal childhood accidents. When he questioned the children about their injuries, they gave vague, rehearsed-sounding explanations that didn't quite make sense. 10-year-old Mary Sullivan, one of the children Harris examined, had unusual scarring on her arms and legs. When asked about the marks, she became visibly distressed and claimed she had fallen down the stairs repeatedly. Harris noted in his private journal that the pattern of scarring was more consistent with deliberate burning than with accidental injury. However, when he attempted to discuss his concerns with head matron Sarah Coleman, she dismissed his observations as the overactive imagination of someone unfamiliar with the challenges of managing orphaned children. Harris's unease grew during subsequent visits. He noticed that certain children seemed to disappear from the home without explanation. When he inquired about a girl named Dorothy Hughes, whom he had treated for a severe respiratory infection, Coleman informed him that Dorothy had been adopted by a family in New Hampshire. However, Harris found it strange that such a sick child would be placed for adoption so quickly, especially without any follow-up medical care. The physician's suspicions were shared by Robert Anderson, a local merchant who delivered supplies to the home. Anderson had been providing goods to the institution for over 5 years and had developed friendly relationships with many of the children. He began to notice that some of his favorite young residents would suddenly be absent from the common areas where he usually encountered them. When he asked about these children, he was told they had been adopted or transferred to other institutions. Anderson's concerns deepened when he discovered that several of the children he had been told were adopted were actually still living at the home, but were apparently being kept in areas he wasn't allowed to visit. He glimpsed familiar faces in windows of the basement level, which staff members claimed was used only for storage and mechanical equipment. When he mentioned these sightings to Theodore Elderglen, the doctor became visibly agitated and suggested that Anderson was mistaken. The pattern of disappearances became more pronounced during the summer of 1894. Margaret Wells, a 12-year-old girl who had been at the home for 3 years, vanished without explanation in July. Her younger brother, who was also a resident, told other children that Margaret had been taken to a special room in the basement for medical treatment and had never returned. When word of this reached some of the home's supporters in Burlington, they were told that Margaret had been adopted by a wealthy family in Montreal who preferred to keep their charitable activities private. Elizabeth Dixon, a local seamstress who provided clothing repairs for the home, noticed that she was increasingly being asked to mend garments with unusual damage. Children's clothes came to her with tears that looked like they had been cut with knives, and fabric that showed signs of being burned or stained with what appeared to be blood. When she questioned head matron Coleman about the damage, she was told that the children were simply more active and accident-prone than most. The most disturbing early warning came from Thomas Lambert, a former resident of the home who had aged out of the system in 1893. Lambert returned to Burlington in the fall of 1894 and attempted to visit some of the younger children he had befriended during his time at the institution. He was denied access to the home and told that former residents were not welcome to visit. This policy was new. In previous years, successful graduates had been encouraged to return and share their experiences with current residents. Lambert persisted in his efforts to contact the home, writing letters and attempting to speak with Theodore Elderglen directly. In one of his letters, which would later be discovered in the home's files, Lambert wrote, "I know what happens in the basement rooms. I know about the special treatments and the children who never come back. Someone needs to stop this before more children disappear." The letter was dated November 15, 1894. 3 days later, Lambert was found dead in his boarding house room, apparently from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The Burlington police investigation was perfunctory, and the death was ruled a suicide. However, Lambert's landlord later told investigators that the young man had seemed optimistic about his future and had just secured a good job at a local factory. He had also mentioned to several people that he was planning to expose wrongdoing at the children's home. As 1894 turned to 1895, the signs of trouble at the Elderglen Children's Home became more difficult to ignore. Dr. Harris documented his concerns in a formal letter to the Vermont State Board of Health, noting unusual injury patterns, suspicious disappearances, and what he termed an atmosphere of fear among the children. The board acknowledged receipt of his complaint, but took no action, stating that the home's excellent reputation and annual state inspections provided adequate oversight. The home's annual inspection in the spring of 1895 was conducted by Walter Green, a state official who had been inspecting the institution for over a decade. Green's report praised the home's facilities, educational programs, and financial management. However, he noted that several children seemed unusually subdued and that his access to certain areas of the building had been restricted. When he requested to see the basement storage areas, he was told that renovation work made them unsafe for visitors. Green's report recommended that future inspections include unrestricted access to all areas of the facility, but this recommendation was ignored by his superiors. The Elderglen family's political connections and charitable reputation made them virtually untouchable, and Green's concerns were dismissed as the product of an overly cautious inspector. By the summer of 1895, at least 8 children had disappeared from the home under suspicious circumstances. Parents who had placed their children there and later tried to visit were told that their children had been adopted or transferred to other institutions. When they demanded specific information about these placements, they were stonewalled by administrators who claimed that confidentiality requirements prevented them from sharing details. The most persistent of these parents was Martha Steele, whose 7-year-old daughter, Ruth Palmer, had been placed at the home in 1893 after Martha's husband died in a factory accident. Martha had been working to improve her financial situation and planned to reclaim her daughter once she could provide a stable home. When she arrived at the home in August 1895 to visit Ruth, she was told that the girl had been adopted by a family in California who had specifically requested that no contact be maintained with the birth family. Martha's attempts to verify this information through official channels were unsuccessful. The Vermont Department of Child Welfare claimed they had no record of Ruth Palmer's adoption, while the Elderglen family's attorney insisted that all placements were conducted according to proper legal procedures. Martha hired a private investigator, but his efforts to trace her daughter's whereabouts led nowhere. The pattern of ignored signs continued through 1896. More children disappeared, more concerned individuals were dismissed or silenced, and the home's reputation remained intact. The Elderglen family's charitable work continued to earn them praise from the community, while their victims remained hidden in the basement chambers that no outsider was allowed to see. As 1897 began, the home housed 57 children, but records suggest that over the previous 3 years, at least 15 children had vanished without proper documentation of their whereabouts. The staff members who might have spoken out had either been dismissed or had died under suspicious circumstances. The community members who had raised concerns had been marginalized or intimidated into silence. The stage was set for the horrific discovery that would finally expose the truth about the Elderglen Children's Home, but it would take a catastrophic fire to bring the family's crimes to light. By then, for many of the children who had disappeared into the basement chambers, it would be far too late. Horror uncovered. The fire that consumed the eastern wing of the Elderglen Children's Home on February 14, 1897, began at approximately 2:30 in the morning. The official investigation would later conclude that faulty heating equipment in the basement had caused the blaze, but the evidence discovered in the aftermath painted a far more sinister picture of what had actually transpired in the building's hidden chambers. Fire Chief Arthur Newman was the first official to reach the scene. His initial report, filed with the Burlington Fire Department, described a blaze that appeared to have multiple points of origin, with the most intense flames concentrated in the basement levels. This pattern was inconsistent with an accidental fire caused by heating equipment, but Newman's superiors ordered him to focus on rescue operations rather than investigating the cause. The fire department's efforts to evacuate the building were hampered by locked doors and barred windows in certain sections of the basement. Firefighters reported hearing screams from below ground level, but were unable to reach the source due to the intensity of the flames and the maze-like layout of the lower levels. By the time the fire was extinguished 6 hours later, the eastern wing had been completely destroyed. The official casualty count listed 17 children as dead, with their bodies recovered from the basement area. However, the condition of the remains immediately raised questions that the authorities seemed reluctant to address. Dr. Harold Price, the coroner brought in to examine the bodies, noted in his preliminary report that many of the skeletons showed signs of trauma that appeared to predate the fire. Dr. Price's detailed examination, conducted over several days, revealed evidence of systematic torture and abuse. The remains of at least 12 children showed signs of repeated bone fractures that had healed improperly, suggesting long-term physical abuse. More disturbing were the modifications found on several skeletons, holes drilled through bones, evidence of surgical procedures conducted without proper medical equipment, and signs of deliberate mutilation. The coroner's most shocking discovery was a series of metal implements embedded in the bones of several victims. These crude surgical tools, apparently left in place during whatever procedures had been performed on the children, had been preserved by the fire's heat. Dr. Price's report described evidence of experimental medical procedures conducted on living subjects, resulting in death through blood loss, infection, or organ failure. However, Dr. Price's full report was never made public. 3 days after completing his examination, he was found dead in his office, apparently from a heart attack. His preliminary notes were seized by city officials who claimed they needed to review them before release. The notes were never returned, and the official cause of death for the 17 children was listed simply as smoke inhalation and burns from accidental fire. The investigation into the fire's cause was led by Detective Raymond Elliott of the Burlington Police Department. Elliott had been suspicious of the home for months, having received multiple complaints about missing children and unusual activities on the property. His investigation of the fire scene revealed evidence that challenged the official narrative. Elliott discovered that the basement of the home contained a network of rooms that were not shown on any official building plans. These chambers, accessed through hidden passages and secured with heavy locks, had been designed for purposes that had nothing to do with caring for orphaned children. The rooms contained medical equipment, restraints, and evidence of activities that Elliott described in his private notes as beyond the scope of human decency. One room contained what appeared to be a surgical suite, complete with operating table, anesthesia equipment, and an array of medical instruments. However, many of the tools were crude and improvised, suggesting that whoever had used them lacked proper medical training. The room's walls were lined with shelves containing glass jars filled with preserved organs and tissue samples, labeled with dates and what appeared to be experimental notes. Another chamber contained restraint devices designed to hold children of various ages. The walls were covered with photographs documenting what appeared to be surgical procedures performed on conscious subjects. Elliott's report noted that the photographs showed evidence of systematic experimentation on living children conducted over a period of several years. The most disturbing discovery was a room that appeared to be used for psychological experimentation. It contained isolation cells, sensory deprivation equipment, and detailed records of behavioral modification techniques. The records, partially destroyed by the fire, documented attempts to break down children's personalities and rebuild them according to the experimenters' specifications. Elliott's investigation also uncovered financial records that revealed the true source of the home's funding. While the institution received donations from the Burlington community, its primary income came from payments by medical colleges and research institutions that were purchasing subjects for experimental research. The records showed payments of up to $500 per child, with bonuses for subjects who met specific physical or psychological criteria. The detective's most significant discovery was a set of correspondence between Dr. Theodore Elderglen and several prominent medical researchers. The letters, found in a fireproof safe in the basement, detailed arrangements for providing research subjects to institutions conducting experimental procedures. One letter, dated January 1896, discussed the delivery of 12 specimens to a medical college in Boston, with specific instructions for their handling and transportation. Elliott's investigation revealed that the Elderglen family had been operating their children's home as a source of human subjects for medical experimentation. The children who disappeared were not adopted or transferred to other institutions. They were being sold to researchers who conducted illegal experiments on them. Those who survived the procedures were often returned to the home's basement chambers, where they were subjected to further abuse until they died. The detective's efforts to bring this information to light were blocked by his superiors, who claimed that his evidence was insufficient and that the family's reputation made such accusations implausible. Elliott was transferred to a different department and warned that pursuing the investigation further would result in his dismissal from the force. However, Elliott had documented his findings thoroughly, and copies of his reports were secretly provided to several journalists and reform advocates. The most complete account of the investigation was given to Eugene Hoffman, a reporter for the Vermont Telegraph who had been investigating rumors about the home for over a year. Hoffman's investigation revealed additional evidence of the home's true nature. He interviewed several former employees who had been dismissed for asking questions about the basement activities. Veree Douglas, a former kitchen worker, described seeing children being taken to the basement who were never seen again. She also reported finding blood-stained clothing and medical waste in areas where such materials should not have been present. The reporter's most significant source was Frances Lowe, a former nurse who had worked at the home for 6 months in 1895. Lowe provided detailed testimony about the medical experiments being conducted in the basement, describing procedures that were designed to test the limits of human endurance rather than to provide therapeutic treatment. She had attempted to report these activities to the authorities, but was told that her accusations were unsubstantiated and that her employment at the home would be terminated if she continued making such claims. Lowe's testimony revealed that Dr. Theodore Elderglen was not conducting these experiments alone. The home regularly received visits from researchers and physicians from medical colleges throughout New England who came to observe procedures and conduct their own experiments. These visitors were told that the children were volunteers from families who could not afford medical care, and that the procedures were being conducted for therapeutic purposes. The investigation also uncovered evidence that the home's staff was complicit in the abuse. Head matron Sarah Coleman had been responsible for selecting which children would be taken to the basement chambers, often choosing those who had no family members, making inquiries about their welfare. Groundskeeper James Franklin had been involved in disposing of bodies and maintaining the secret passages that connected the basement chambers. As the evidence mounted, it became clear that the Elderglen Children's Home had been operating as a cover for one of the most systematic and horrific cases of child abuse in American history. The fire that destroyed the eastern wing had been set deliberately, not by accident, but by someone who wanted to eliminate evidence of the crimes that had been committed there. The investigation revealed that at least 43 children had disappeared from the home over a period of 7 years, with only 17 bodies recovered from the fire scene. The fate of the remaining children remained unknown, though evidence suggested that many had been sold to researchers who conducted experiments that resulted in their deaths. Legacy and silence. The aftermath of the Elderglen Children's Home fire revealed a web of corruption and cover-up that extended far beyond the institution itself. Despite the overwhelming evidence of systematic abuse and murder, the official response was swift and decisive, not in pursuing justice, but in burying the truth so deep that it would remain hidden for nearly 8 decades. Within 48 hours of Detective Raymond Elliott's preliminary report reaching the Burlington mayor's office, a coordinated effort began to suppress the investigation. Mayor Carl Bennett, who had received substantial campaign contributions from the Elderglen family over the years, ordered that all evidence from the fire scene be sealed, pending a thorough review by appropriate authorities. This review never took place, and the evidence was quietly destroyed over the following months. The surviving members of the Elderglen family, Dr. Theodore Elderglen and his wife Helen, disappeared from Burlington within a week of the fire. Official records indicate that they relocated to California, where Theodore resumed his medical practice under an assumed name. However, private correspondence discovered decades later revealed that the family had actually fled to Europe, where they lived comfortably on funds that had been secretly transferred to Swiss banks. The 40 children who survived the fire were quickly dispersed to other institutions throughout New England, with strict instructions that they were not to discuss their experiences at the Elderglen home. Most were placed in facilities far from Burlington, making it difficult for journalists or investigators to locate and interview them. Those who attempted to speak out about what they had witnessed were dismissed as traumatized children whose memories could not be trusted. The most systematic effort to silence witnesses came in the form of a series of accidents and suicides that befell individuals who had knowledge of the home's true activities. Eugene Hoffman, the Vermont Telegraph reporter who had been investigating the case, was found dead in his apartment 3 weeks after the fire. The official cause of death was listed as carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty heating system, but friends noted that Hoffman had been in excellent health and had recently had his heating system inspected. Dr. William Harris, the physician who had first raised concerns about the home's treatment of children, died in a carriage accident in May 1897. The accident occurred on a road he had traveled safely hundreds of times, and witnesses reported that his normally calm horse had suddenly bolted for no apparent reason. An examination of the animal revealed evidence of chemical burns that suggested it had been deliberately injured to cause the accident. Marie Douglas, the former kitchen worker who had provided testimony about the basement activities, was found dead in Lake Champlain in June 1897. The death was ruled a suicide, despite the fact that Douglas had been a strong swimmer and had shown no signs of mental distress. Her body showed evidence of trauma that was inconsistent with drowning, but the coroner who examined her was the same official who had replaced Dr. Harold Price after his convenient death. The systematic elimination of witnesses was accompanied by a campaign to rehabilitate the Elderglen family's reputation. Local newspapers, many of which had received advertising revenue from businesses owned by the family, published articles emphasizing the family's years of charitable work and suggesting that the fire had been a tragic accident that had claimed the lives of both children and their devoted caretakers. The Burlington Free Press published a series of editorials defending the family's legacy, arguing that the rumors and accusations circulating in the community were the product of grief and confusion rather than fact. The paper's editor, who had been a close friend of Cornelius Elderglen, wrote, "We must not allow tragedy to tarnish the memory of a family that dedicated their lives to caring for society's most vulnerable members." The Elderglen Children's Home was a beacon of hope and compassion, and those who would use its destruction to spread malicious gossip dishonor the memory of the children who died there. The official investigation was concluded in September 1897 with a final report that attributed the fire to faulty heating equipment and the deaths to smoke inhalation and burns. The report made no mention of the experimental chambers found in the basement, the medical equipment discovered at the scene, or the evidence of systematic abuse found on the victims' remains. All physical evidence was reported as having been destroyed in the fire or rendered unusable by smoke and water damage. The financial records of the home were sealed by court order, ostensibly to protect the privacy of donors who had contributed to the institution's charitable work. In reality, these records contained evidence of the payments received for providing children to medical researchers, as well as documentation of the extensive network of corruption that had enabled the abuse for so long. The property where the home had stood was sold to a lumber company owned by associates of the Elderglen family. The remaining buildings were demolished, and the land was logged extensively, removing any remaining evidence of the crimes that had been committed there. The basement chambers were filled with concrete and debris, ensuring that they could never be excavated or examined. The children who had survived the fire and been placed in other institutions faced a lifetime of trauma and silence. Those who attempted to speak out about their experiences were often dismissed as disturbed or unreliable. Many developed severe mental health problems that were attributed to their experiences as orphans, rather than to the specific abuse they had suffered at the Elderglen home. Alice Norton, one of the few survivors who lived to adulthood and maintained her sanity, spent decades trying to bring attention to what had happened at the home. Her attempts to contact journalists, law enforcement officials, and reform advocates were consistently ignored or dismissed. In 1943, she published a self-funded pamphlet titled The Truth About Elderglen, which detailed her experiences and called for a new investigation into the home's activities. Norton's pamphlet was quickly suppressed, with most copies being purchased and destroyed by individuals who claimed to be collectors of historical documents. Norton herself was committed to a mental institution later that year, where she died in 1945 under suspicious circumstances. Her death was attributed to complications from depression, but medical records suggested that she had been subjected to experimental psychiatric treatments that were not approved for use on human subjects. The cover-up was so complete that by the 1920s most Burlington residents had forgotten about the Elderglen Children's Home entirely. The few who remembered the fire recalled it as a tragic accident that had claimed the lives of several orphaned children. The true scope of the crimes committed there had been erased from public memory, leaving behind only vague rumors and half-remembered stories. The Elderglen family's charitable legacy was preserved through the establishment of the Elderglen Foundation, which continued to provide scholarships and support for orphaned children throughout Vermont. The Foundation's literature made no mention of the children's home or the circumstances of its destruction, focusing instead on the family's early philanthropic work and their commitment to helping those in need. It wasn't until 1975, nearly 8 decades after the fire, that a graduate student named Lawrence Harper stumbled upon evidence of the true story while researching his dissertation on 19th-century child welfare institutions. Harper discovered a cache of documents that had been hidden in the basement of the Burlington courthouse, including copies of Detective Elliott's suppressed reports and photographs of the experimental chambers found in the home's basement. Harper's attempts to bring this information to light were met with the same resistance that had silenced earlier investigators. His academic advisor discouraged him from pursuing the topic, suggesting that his career would be better served by focusing on less controversial subjects. When Harper persisted, he found himself unable to access university resources and was eventually forced to abandon his research. The documents Harper discovered were quietly removed from the courthouse basement and have never been seen again. Harper himself left academia shortly after completing his degree and spent the rest of his life working in occupations that had nothing to do with historical research. He died in 1998, taking his knowledge of the Elderglen case with him to the grave. Today, the site where the Elderglen Children's Home once stood is occupied by a shopping center and parking lot. A small plaque near the entrance mentions that the area was once home to a charitable institution for orphaned children, but makes no reference to the crimes that were committed there or the children who died in the basement chambers. The truth about the Elderglen Children's Home remains buried, protected by decades of cover-up and the passage of time. The children who died there have no graves, no memorials, and no justice. Their stories exist only in suppressed documents and faded memories, testament to the power of institutional corruption and the ease with which society can choose to forget its most uncomfortable truths. The Elderglen case stands as a reminder that the most horrific crimes can be committed by those who present themselves as pillars of society, and that the systems designed to protect the vulnerable can themselves become instruments of abuse. It also demonstrates how completely the truth can be buried when those in power have sufficient motivation and resources to hide it. The fire that destroyed the eastern wing of the Elderglen Children's Home was not an accident, but a deliberate act designed to eliminate evidence of systematic child abuse and murder. The 43 children who disappeared from the home between 1890 and 1897 were not adopted or transferred to other institutions. They were victims of medical experiments that treated human beings as disposable research subjects. The legacy of the Elderglen Children's Home is not one of Christian charity and moral education, but of systematic evil protected by institutional power and social respectability. The silence that has surrounded this case for over a century is not the result of forgotten history, but of deliberate suppression by those who valued reputation and political convenience over justice for the most vulnerable members of society. The children who died in the basement chambers of the Elderglen Children's Home deserved better than the silence that has been their only memorial. Their stories deserve to be told, their suffering acknowledged, and their deaths properly mourned. But more than anything, their case serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked institutional power and the ease with which society can choose to look the other way when confronted with uncomfortable truths. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way, we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.